Today we are continuing with our reading plan, year 2, and we're back to Plato. We're going to do one of his dialogues of Socrates called Meno. This is a Socratic dialogue that opens with the character Meno asking Socrates whether virtue can be taught. Virtue is the big idea under discussion here. Usually the dialogues cover an idea like that and they try to define it. And that's what we're going into here. This leads to a deep dive into the nature of virtue or human excellence and knowledge. Knowledge is a big idea here too. And after Meno fails to provide a unified definition of virtue, offering instead a fragmented list of traits, Socrates introduces a demonstration to argue that learning is actually a process of recollection, meaning our souls inherently possess immortal knowledge before birth. And he does this, this is kind of known as like Meno's paradox, the claim that learning is impossible because you can't search for what you don't already know. How can you find what you're looking for if you don't know what you're looking for? And Socrates, to demonstrate this, he calls over an uneducated slave boy to prove that learning is actually a recollection of innate knowledge. And he uses this stick and he draws in the dirt, and there's actually a graphic in the text to show you what this geometric puzzle is all about. And he draws a square with sides of 2 feet. The total area is 4 square feet. And then he asks the boy how long the sides must be to create a new square with exactly double the area. And the boy answers wrong. He intuitively guesses that 4 feet, you double the side length, that's going to get you the answer. But he shows them that that's not the case. That actually generates an area of 16 square feet. And then the boy guesses 3 feet, and Socrates shows that that's 3 squared, which is 9. And the boy at that point realizes he doesn't know the answer, and he admits his own ignorance. And Socrates says, aha, Meno, that boy is now better off because he knows that he doesn't know. And this his false confidence that he knew the answer has been diminished. So, Socrates is always talking about that. Knowing what you don't know, knowing that you don't know is really the first step towards wisdom. The solution, he gives him the solution. He sort of draws diagonal lines, triangular halves in the square, and he gets the boy to correctly realize that a square is built upon the diagonal of the original square. And, there's a lot of geometry, and, kind of almost going above my head. So it's just an example, a demonstration. And Socrates then sort of comments and says, the boy, he never really, Socrates never explicitly gave the boy the answer to the question. He only asked questions, which is Socrates' MO. And because the uneducated boy arrived at this complex mathematical truth purely through guided questioning, then knowledge must have already existed in the boy's immortal soul. How else would he have recognized the truth of it? Anyway, this is followed by a strange interlude. It almost seemed like an interpolation into the dialogue, where Socrates and Meno, they're now questioning, they're continuing their discussion about whether virtue can be taught or not. And seeking a local opinion, Socrates invites over Anytus. Anytus, a prominent, wealthy Athenian, he's going to converse for a while. And this acts as this sort of dramatic turning point in the dialogue. Things get a little tense. And Socrates interrogates Anytus and says, where should one send a young person to learn virtue? And he points out, by analogy, he's always using analogies. If you want to learn medicine, you go to a physician. If you want to learn shoemaking, you go to a shoemaker. If you want to learn virtue, who do you go to? Do you go to the sophists? Well, that's a loaded question because we know that Socrates and Plato didn't think much of the sophists. And Anytus seems to not think of much of them either. And Anytus becomes sort of irrationally furious at the mere mention of the sophists, and he calls them a plague on society and says, no respectable citizen should associate with them. When Socrates asks how young men are supposed to learn virtue if not from such teachers, Anytus claims that any decent Athenian could teach a young person simply by example. You can model virtue. And Socrates then dismantles that claim, and he lists a bunch of virtuous Athenian leaders and points out that while they gave their sons the best education in riding and in wrestling and in music, none of them managed to teach their sons how to be virtuous. And I wonder if he's kind of like, he's making like an argument that Anytus is not a virtuous man. You're not as virtuous as your father. I'm not sure. Anyway, incapable of answering Socrates, as very few of these interlocutors are able to go toe-to-toe with Socrates, Anytus gets hostile, and he snaps back a very dark warning to Socrates, a veiled threat. He says, if you speak ill of people, this could come back to bite you. And that's foreshadow of the Apology, where Socrates was put on trial, and one of his accusers, lo and behold, will be Anytus. Anyway, it's a strange interlude, I think, in the dialogue. And then ultimately the dialogue shifts back to like this practical discussion. They're exploring then the difference between true belief and actual knowledge of virtue. And it concludes with this paradoxical suggestion that virtue might just simply be a divine gift rather than something that you can practically, structurally, disciplined fashion, like walk your way into or towards. As with most of these dialogues, it kind of ends with just like not really answering the question ultimately, but you get a little bit of a hint where Socrates is headed with it. Anyway, just to review, some major issues you'll find in this dialogue, some big ideas, would be the definition of virtue. They are exploring whether virtue is a single universal concept or a collection of different behaviors relative to the person's role in society. They are exploring this thing known as Meno's paradox, debating how a person can actively search for something if they don't know what they're searching for. You want knowledge, you need knowledge, you want to attain knowledge. How do you know where to look for it? And then the theory of recollection of knowledge. Here they're conjecturing about this claim that the human soul is immortal and already possesses knowledge, and your job when you become educated is to if you're lucky enough to have a guide, someone like Socrates, they will draw you out and prompt you to recollect this, to remember it. What you already know, but you've forgotten that you know it. That's sort of how he's trying to get around that paradox. Also, the question of whether virtue is teachable. And then this knowledge versus true belief debate. Why stable, reasoned knowledge is more valuable than a correct opinion or a right opinion or a lucky guess about it. We can dig into that one a little bit more, talking about, what transforms true belief into actual knowledge. Could it be the act of binding it to something anchored, something stable? This links back to Socrates' point about recollection. I mean, by working out the underlying reasons why something is true, you tie the belief down so it can't escape your grasp. sort of wrapped up with critical inquiry, isn't it? And this is why, true belief isn't really the ultimate way to understand virtue. There's also, in terms of like just immediate practical action, like the pragmatics, true belief can be just as effective as knowledge. So you have to be very careful when you're reading Plato and Socrates, his mouthpiece, that he goes back and forth a lot. He's many twists and turns, and it's part of the pleasure of reading Plato, I think, is he's not just telling you what to think, he's like turning it around, right? And inviting you to reflect on these things. So true belief can be just as effective if you're just talking about pragmatics. Like, for instance, if a tour guide knows the road to Larissa, they will get you there safely. If another guy has never been there but makes a lucky guess, a correct guess about which path to take, they will also get you there safely. So, maybe they go on a hunch or just kind of like a lucky guess. It can be just as practical, then it's sort of hard to distinguish between the one who has knowledge and the one who just has a belief. So the final verdict is, while both of these paths lead to the same successful outcome in the short term, true belief tends to be fickle and fragile. And Socrates is positioning knowledge as a far superior possession because it's more stable and it ensures that you have a permanent guide for your life and for your actions. But the problem again comes back to, how do you attain this knowledge? And that's kind of left open-ended. That's very typical for Plato. All right, here's a little batch, a few discussion questions. So if you're leading a great books discussion group, or you just want to journal about these, or just think about them, or you want to leave a comment and answer one or more of these questions, I'm all ears. I don't have big answers for these big idea questions. I'm just asking the questions. First of all, on the idea of virtue, Meno defines virtue based on a person's social role. This is like early in the dialogue. Like, there's a man's virtue, there's a woman's virtue, there's a ruler's virtue. So depending on what your role is in society, there's like different kind of virtues for each. The question is there a universal human virtue that transcends these social roles, transcends eras of time, or is virtue always relative to your position in society? Next, Socrates argues that if you don't know what something is, you cannot know its qualities. And you can't know whether it can be taught. So they really struggle to define virtue. And then related to that is the fact that it's probably really hard to teach virtue. Do you agree that we must fully define a concept before we can understand it, and before we can understand how it functions or how to acquire such knowledge? Next, let's look at the paradox again. Searching for knowledge is impossible because you either already know it, so you don't really need to conduct a search, or you don't know it, so you won't recognize it when you find it. How well does Socrates' theory of recollection solve this paradox? And does it change how you view the role of education and teaching and the role of a teacher? I've taught a few classes in my day, and I kind of think that my approach probably was, I always saw myself as not like the preacher laying down the law, but just the person asking the questions, trying to draw people out. So I think maybe this was my early reading of Plato that like rubbed off on me, but I sort of like this theory of recollection. I can't prove that it's true, but I think it's a nice educational or pedagogical assumption that you're trying to draw people out to recognize what they sort of already know, but they haven't really understood it in this way yet. And yeah, it also makes lifelong learning interesting too, because like some of these understandings take a lifetime to understand, like these big ideas like what is virtue. That might mean something to you when you're young, that it means something very different to you when you're in the middle age or old age. A couple more questions and then we'll wrap up. Now, Socrates draws a distinction between true belief, which can guide us sort of by chance or by feel, and knowledge, which is tethered to like working out causes and sort of standing up to critical scrutiny. Well, in our modern world, does it matter if someone does the right thing based on chance, like an unexamined belief, act of faith, rather than deep understanding? Does it make a difference in our modern world? And then lastly, by the end of the dialogue, Socrates kind of playfully suggests that virtue might just be a gift from the gods. If virtue cannot be explicitly taught, like you can teach geometry or like you can teach medicine, how do people actually become good? Because virtue is a really big idea that seems to be important for leading a moral life and leading a life of wisdom. So yeah, I think it's a little bit destabilized here when you get to the end of the Meno. Like he leaves us hanging, leaves us in suspense. Anyway, it is a fun dialogue to read. I feel like it's sort of Plato in his prime, and that whole foreshadowing of the accusation of Anytus is a sort of an odd interlude in the text. I almost wonder if Plato sort of inserted that, like, after the fact. I'm not sure. But yeah, tell me what you think of Meno, what you think of these questions. Let's move on. Our next stage in the reading journey is Aristotle on poetics. A short work, but a very influential one. And it's about literary criticism and understanding like tragedies and things like that. A lot of like foundational ideas that are still with us today. So it'll be fun to go through that next time on our series. If you're new to the series, you can subscribe to the playlist and watch all the previous episodes, and you'll know, when there's a new one that's coming on board. And as always, I thank you for your time. Appreciate your comments. Have a great day. We'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.